Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our continuing read-along of Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. I'm doing a read-along of this with David Murphy. I'll leave a link to his channel down below. And we're doing it in a different way than most read-alongs are done because we wanted to sort of nod in the direction of the massive, seismic influence that this book had on a whole generation of young people. There's an open question as to whether or not it still exerts any of that kind of impression, but I myself would argue that Hitchens himself, and this book in particular, is responsible for a large amount of aftershocks. Far larger amount of aftershocks in different places than you might think to look, than people usually think. And in a nod of the head to that kind of influence, we are doing a chapter a day of God is Not Great for as long as it takes us to run out of chapters. And we're on chapter 8 today, the title of which is The Evil of the New Testament Exceeds That of the Old Testament. And we should state right up front something that if you've been doing this read along, I had a couple of people who admittedly don't know me that well. I give everybody my email address. It's st.donahue@gmail. Email me about anything you want. But I give that email address enough now so that I get tons of emails a day, and a lot of them come from people who don't know me from a hole in the wall. And quite a few of those people emailed weeks ago disliking the choice of this read along and decrying my motivation and David's motivation, saying, well, you know, just because you two are starstruck with this Christopher Hitchens person doesn't mean you should inflict it on the rest of us. And I had two responses to that. One is a standard response that I have to people who make sentiments like that, which is, if you're encountering a channel, actually, I will be folding this into, I'm going to make a video on BookTube etiquette. I'm going to make another video on BookTube etiquette. But I can allow it to stand on its own now. If you're encountering a channel, maybe even subscribe to a channel, that is consistently doing nothing that you like, unsubscribe and stop watching it. Okay? Just unsubscribe and stop watching it. But don't do what it seems to be normal for people to do on the internet, which is to assume that will change, that your dislike will change the channel. No, just you misjudged it or it changed, but one way or another, do whatever, tell yourself whatever you have to make yourself feel good. But don't leave comments asking for the channel to change. Criticism, sure. You got this wrong, sure. I disagree with you about this and here's why, sure. Provided it's not done with personal insults. There's absolutely nothing that obliges me to put up with personal insults. Nothing whatsoever. Not just on YouTube, but anywhere in the world. I no longer work in retail. I don't have to put up with insults from anyone, anywhere, under any circumstance. And I don't. I absolutely don't. And I'm not going to do it on this channel either. So, you know, if you want to disagree, fine, if you do it with a civil tongue in your head. But if you want to fundamentally object, then don't. Just leave. You know, you've got plenty of other YouTube channels to choose from. But I'm hoping that a lot of those objections have been put to rest by these first 8 videos that David and I have done. It should be obvious, even to someone who's hate watching. And let's be honest, don't we all hate watch David Murphy? It should be obvious by now that neither one of us worships at the altar of Christopher Hitchens. We have been mighty harsh on this author. And so I should point out right at the beginning of this chapter that the chapter titled The Evils of the New Testament Exceeds That of the Old Testament never even comes close to gesturing at demonstrating that claim. Never even close. In person, in conversation, Hitchens would often say, well, you know, when you're in the Old Testament and you're doing battle with the Amalekites and you fall with a spear in your belly and the earth closes over you, that's the end of the story. Whereas in the New Testament, now that Jesus is on the scene talking about eternal damnation and he depart from me into eternal flame, all of a sudden there is a concept that you can suffer forever. All of a sudden there is the embryonic concept of a hell. And also Jesus and the New Testament telling you, Jesus saying, it's not just enough for you to not act on impure thoughts. You must not have the thoughts in the first place. And that the thought is just as bad as the act, a patent piece of nonsense. Hitchens, you know, lumped all those things together in conversations and in many lectures and said that the New Testament is worse than the Old Testament because it moves inside the human being. It moves into the realm of thought crime, which is not so much done in the Old Testament. Again, this is a little bit of a shallow reading on his part. Plenty of people in the Old Testament suffer because of evil in their heart. In other words, not necessarily visible. And plenty of people, well, the contention is never addressed, much less walked through its paces in this chapter. And it couldn't be anyway. There is, if we're mapping suddenly the stuff that we're seeing in these works of literature onto the real world, nothing compares with the Old Testament. It's one genocide after another. It's one act of horrific brutality after another, even on a personal level. Fathers sacrificing their daughters. Fathers being willing to sacrifice their son until God stops them. And so on and so forth. We've talked before about the innumerable innocent people, babies, little 1-year-olds toddling or crawling around on the rug. In other words, beings who could not be guilty of anything, who die in the plagues on Egypt, who die in Sodom and Gomorrah, who die with the Noachian flood. The Bible is, the Old Testament is soaked to the eyeballs in the blood of innocents. The New Testament is not. There's no argument I think you can make to say that it's worse than the Old Testament. But it does afford Christopher Hitchens the same freedom to just shoot in any direction and be sure of a hit that he had in the last chapter. In the last chapter, he just sort of flailed all around him in the direction of the idiocies, the inconsistencies, the horrors of the Old Testament. And it's very entertaining reading. And in his video about that, David mentioned a phrase. He used a phrase that I've been trying to avoid in talking about God is not great because it comes immediately to mind. And that phrase is shooting fish in a barrel. And unfortunately, there's no way to avoid it when it comes to Christianity, when it comes to the New Testament. Because there are all but the most ardent Orthodox crackpots will admit that there are chunks of the Old Testament that are purely literature. They are, that you might technically say, in some distant approximation, that they are divinely inspired, but you're reading them as literature. Like, for instance, I asked an old friend of mine once, who was an Orthodox rabbi, I asked him, if you discover tomorrow that you had physical access to an Amalekite, or Hivite, or Hittite, would you murder them? Would you run across the street and kill them with your bare hands? Would you knock them down and throw them into traffic? And he said, no, I wouldn't murder anyone under any circumstances whatsoever, even if they murdered my own family. You know that. And I said, well, okay, not killing someone who murders your own family is you not taking vengeance, which is the Lord's. And he is jealous of that. He says so. I will conduct vengeance. You will not. But murdering a Hivite or a Hittite has been enjoined on you by God. He has commanded you to kill these people until none are left. And the only reason that you're not doing it is because none are left. What if one were left? That command has never rescinded. Wouldn't you feel like you had to do it? And he had some choice words for me. he always had a way. He had the perfect Yiddish put down in every situation. I believe in that case I was a schmozzle. but one way or another, I almost forget my point. Where was I going with that? That's a problem when you're very old. I don't know what David's excuse is. He does it almost as much as I do. Well, anyway, you get the point that I'm trying to say. You look at the Old Testament, and it's just this enormous ribbon of evil, but it doesn't have a lot of carryover, whereas the New Testament rules the world. Christianity ruled the world, and very often, for centuries, ruled it with an iron fist, ruled it with the power of state, with the power of coercion and torture and death. And that makes the scrutinizing of the consistency and the horrors of the New Testament not only all the more important, but all the easier. The Old Testament at least has the excuse of having been composed over centuries by dozens and dozens of people, none of whom knew each other, and none of whom knew each other's literary traditions. Whereas the New Testament has a fairly concentrated provenance. It's not nearly as concentrated as Christians think it is. There was no Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. There were none of the four Gospels are eyewitness accounts, or even close. They are transcribed folklore. Same thing as the Old Testament, only maybe from fewer sources. But we're not talking about. We're not talking about eyewitness documents here. We're not talking about reliable testimony of any kind. That no, we're not talking about any of that. But you look at the New Testament in light of the massive effect that it has had on the world. How many millions of people have died as a result of this slim work? Divorce it from the Old Testament and print it as a book. It'd take you an hour to read. Naturally, under those circumstances, the minute that religious authority starts to lose its teeth, the minute it no longer is able to rack and destroy its enemies, those enemies are going to come forward by the bushel, pointing out the inconsistencies in the Gospels, for instance. If we just leave it to the Gospels and leave out the Acts and the Epistles and Revelation, if we just leave it to the Gospels, there have been innumerable books by people. Once they no longer feared exile, torture, or death, there were innumerable books by people pointing out that this whole thing cannot possibly be divinely inspired, because there are many, 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 many instances where accounts directly contradict each other. So unless you're talking about a divinely inspired divine being who is severely schizoid, some of these things have to be just plain wrong. And that became a parlor game. That still is a parlor game. And that is what David referred to as shooting fish in a barrel. And the one shadow of disagreement, we haven't really fundamentally disagreed with each other yet in this read-along, which is kind of strange considering that we're not coordinating with each other. The one way that I might slightly disagree with him, he seemed to poo-poo that exercise for its worth. And I think it does have worth, because I think he says that when you are new to the whole falling out of your religion world, when you are new to leaving your religion, it's one of the first things people do is immediately start picking apart the inconsistencies in the Gospels. And there was a slight shade of disappointment, disapproval in his voice for how easy that is and how effective that is. And I might disagree. I have seen so many young people who maybe started that as an exercise, still firm in their faith, but the exercise itself helped a lot to unmoor their faith. And I'm not saying that that's a worthwhile goal, but if you think it's a worthwhile goal, then these Gospels, doing this to the Gospels, definitely has a worthwhile effect. I myself believe that if you are putting your personal faith in a document, then you deserve everything you get if the document can be ripped apart. Faith should come from elsewhere. But Hitchens writes this. He just does the same thing in this chapter, just bashes Christianity left, right, and center. He picks his choices. He picks some inconsistencies instead of others. Again, a whole book could be written on the subject, and many, many have been. He has a bit here where he just recites his main claims from earlier chapters. He writes, "The contradictions and illiteracies of the New Testament have filled up many books by eminent scholars and have never been explained by any Christian authority except in the feeblest terms of, quote, metaphor or Christ of faith. This feebleness derives from the fact that until recently, Christians could simply burn or silence anybody who asked any inconvenient questions. The Gospels are useful, however, in re-demonstrating the same point as their predecessor volumes, which is that religion is man-made." And he takes this even to the central point of Jesus Christ himself, and analyzing what Jesus was and what he's trying to say. What kind of a figure is he in this literary work that is opened before Christopher Hitchens? And of course, he comes to C.S. Lewis. And again, in this chapter, as he has a few times in the book so far, he takes pot shots before he quotes from Lewis. And only in this chapter it becomes obvious why he's doing that. He in previous chapters, he has simply disdainfully referred to Lewis as an incomprehensible bungler, as a very poor spokesman for Christianity. And you wonder why that is. Why would he pick on C.S. Lewis when there are so many crackpot Christian spokespeople who he could pick on instead? And in this chapter, you suddenly realize why. Because in this chapter, he repeats a couple of times that Lewis is not only, in his opinion, threadbare and derivative and a little silly, but also immensely popular. He's immensely popular. And that's what bothers Christopher Hitchens. No one can be immensely popular but him. Hitchens wrote this book because he went to one too many literary events or soirees or parties in his own apartment and had people say, "What do you think of that Dawkins book?" That's the reason he did this. Not because he thinks religion or Mother Teresa or Henry Kissinger or the Clintons poison everything, but because he couldn't stand that. He couldn't stand that. And the same thing is true with C.S. Lewis. He'll take a shot in any direction if he gets a chance to do that. At one point later on in the book, he takes a totally gratuitous shot at Susan Armstrong, the popular religious historian, for no reason whatsoever. The reason on the page is utterly ridiculous, and the reason in reality is because she's popular. Is her name Susan? Or is it Karen Armstrong? It's Karen Armstrong, isn't it? He takes a shot at her out of the blue. And if you don't know how popular she was when he did that, you won't have any idea why he's doing it. But he gets eventually in this chapter to C.S. Lewis, because he's discussing the nature of Jesus Christ and all the people around Jesus Christ. He makes a very funny observation about how Mary, the Virgin Mother of Jesus, whenever she reappears in the Gospel, seems to have completely forgotten all that business about the angel Gabriel and the Immaculate Conception. She seems to have completely forgotten that she gave birth to the Messiah and was clearly told that fact by an emissary from heaven, because she's always dumbfounded by what's going on in Jesus' life. You did what? Hey, what? You're going to change the water into what? That's kind of neat. Hitchens makes a sly comment about how she inquires after his life, of course, because she's a Jewish mother. But when he gets to the nature of Jesus and when he gets to C.S. Lewis, he reprints a passage from Lewis that is often reprinted. And that I want to reread to you in case you're not familiar with it, because it's Lewis himself analyzing what we can make of Jesus, what we can possibly make of Jesus. And he shuts the door firmly. Lewis says, he's either lunatic or Lord. He's either insane or he's the Son of God, as he said he was. And Lewis wants to shut the door firmly on one other alternative. And he puts it like this. This is the one thing we must not say. The thing that he's talking about is that Jesus is simply a human teacher, an oft-quoted and venerated rabbi. He says, this is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level of a man who says he is a poached egg, or he would else be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. I love that passage, and it's absolutely true. I have often maintained that the one thing, the one silver bullet for anybody whose faith may be weak, the one thing to show them the real inconsistency, the real feat of clay of the New Testament, of the four Gospels, is not to pick at the inconsistencies. There are innumerable inconsistencies. The gospel traditions, these literary traditions. We're talking about two different literary traditions. One of which is there are three. The Synoptic Gospels sort of copy and paste and improve on each other, and then there's John. But those two literary traditions don't agree on anything that they should agree on. They should all agree on, if these were really transmuted, a generation old first-hand accounts, they would not disagree fundamentally on the Last Supper, for instance, engraved in everyone's mind, the crucifixion. And they do. They disagree on all of these things. There are two different genealogies for Jesus. If one had been accepted, if even Jesus had talked about it, then there would only be one, and so on and so forth, all the way down the line. If that is true, those inconsistencies wouldn't be there. And keep in mind, I don't believe those are true. There's a lot of Christian scholarship, so-called, that is religiously driven. Even now in the 21st century, a lot of it is religiously driven. I don't believe in most of the foremost arguments about the antiquity of these Gospels. Christians have been trying to backdate it closer and closer to AD 33 over centuries. And they have managed to do that. And I don't believe that any of that is true. I don't think any of these things date reliably from any time before the reign of Trajan, 100 years later. And even that, I would think, would be generous. But that's a scholarly argument for another day. The point that Lewis is saying is that this is not something you can secularize. And Hitchens quotes it, but doesn't really seem to opine on it. And the one thing that he's skirting when he quotes it, he touches a little bit on this a couple of times in the chapter, but then doesn't do much with it. is to go one step further. The one step further you can go, he mentions that Lewis takes this step, but he doesn't really investigate it himself, and I don't know quite why. Maybe it would have required too much work. But the one step that you could go further is to say not only that Jesus closed the door on him being merely a secular rabbi who spoke wisdom and has since been, turned into a god, but that Jesus himself as a discrete person never existed. Hitchens flirts with it, but he doesn't really get in bed with it, so to speak. And it happens to be my opinion. I had an old friend a long time ago, long since dead, who this was one of his favorite things. He did an enormous amount of research on it. I kept telling him, you should write a book on this. Don't just do piles and piles of research. Write a book with your arguments instead of just reciting them to me and taking me through them verse by verse and document by document. But alas, he never did. As far as I know, there is not even a fragmentary manuscript, which I could maybe Frankenstein into a book. But he wasn't alone, of course. Scholars have held this opinion for a long time. Some of them have. They are by the establishment, they are often considered renegades and irresponsible, but I don't believe they are. I am firmly of the opinion that there was no actual historical Jesus. I've looked at the documentary evidence, and it's virtually non-existent. It's totally circular. You have to take the Gospels as historical records, and they are clearly not. They are wrong about most of the history that they use. And if you're going to use them as historical records for someone named Jesus who was preaching in Galilee at the reign of Herod Antipas, then where are you going to stop? How are you going to draw the line? And you can see immediately why Christians would be attracted to the idea of using the Gospels as historical documents to verify the historical existence of Jesus Christ. Because where are you going to draw the line? If you say that the Gospel of Mark is a historical document attesting to the historical veracity of the character of Jesus, well, what about the miracles? What about the resurrection? That's in there too. Then you'll get Christian scholars, even sometimes very well-trained Christian scholars, who say, well, then I guess. No. The Gospels are religious documents. They are religious folklore. They are propaganda. They are not in any way historical, and they cannot be relied upon as historical documents. So when you're talking about whether or not Jesus existed as a person in history, whether or not he actually had a presence for 33 years or whatever, you have to do it without the Gospels. You have to take them out of the equation, and you're left with nothing if you do that. Almost nothing. A few fugitive references here and there to the school of Christ. But the man himself, a birth, an inscription, a description, that isn't even in the Gospels. Much like we don't know what Jesus looks like in the Gospels. We have no idea. Why, if you were a Gospel writer, if you were allegedly transcribing firsthand accounts of the Lord and Savior of your people, why wouldn't you say what he looked like, what he sounded like, what he did, instead of just doxology? That's all you have in the Gospels. Almost, that's all you have. And the silver bullet, the surefire way to dislodge a Christian from their blanket faith in that is to have them actually read the Gospels. Most Christians have not, even though it takes an hour to do. Most Christians have not read them. Instead, they've had excerpts cherry-picked at religious services, or they've read cherry-picked excerpts. Most Christians have not sat down and actually read their way through the four Gospels. Now, I'm not saying that it would be a silver bullet because they would immediately notice contradictions. They will, if they're reading honestly. They'll immediately notice contradictions all throughout. If you sit down and just read the four Gospels in one afternoon, without taking a break, without allowing the metaphor machinery that you have been raised from the cradle to have in your mind to work, you will see right away that there are an infinite number of contradictions. It's more than that, though. It's not the contradictions. It's that you'll start to get an impression of Jesus, especially when you start to encounter passage after passage after passage after passage from the Gospels that you've never seen cherry-picked, that you almost are unfamiliar with completely, and that give a very human and a very unattractive portrait of this character, even in composite, even when all four of the writers are trying to make him a god. Still, the composite portrait that you get if you read all these things right away in short order, without interpretation and without a gloss, is extremely unattractive. But even so, even if you leave that out, even if you don't bother with that at all, I'm not talking about the Gospels, because the Gospels are religious documents, and they claim to be infallible and inspired by God. So you can't use them as historical documents, obviously. You can't do that. And no one in history, in actual history, no one writing history noticed a man wandering through Galilee, attracting gigantic crowds and healing people of mortal illnesses. No one noticed that. That exists. That is attested to nowhere else in literature except the Gospels, and there is no contemporary attestation whatsoever. None. None. And as many scholars have pointed out, all you would need is one thing. These people are called the historicists. These historicists are fairly generous people, most of them. My friend was not. He said, no, I don't just want one thing. I want a barrage of things. Look at how important this character is in history. I want slam bang, uncontrovertible physical evidence that he existed. I don't want just one hint here or there. I want a lot, because of how much influence this whole thing has had on human history, on my life. But most of them aren't. Most of them say just one. One thing is all I would need to just lay the matter to rest. It makes no difference to me whether Jesus existed as a historical character or not. Christianity is still the important thing. I agree with that. Most of them will say, just give me one thing. One thing. A spice merchant from Arimathea, who just happens to be making his way through Palestine, and notices crowds, or maybe even meets Jesus, or meets someone who just met Jesus and writes a letter home, or makes a marginalia of some kind or other, instead of coming to me with obvious forgeries from Josephus, or a bland and very blanket reference to a movement that is contained in one line of Tacitus. Instead of doing that, why don't you come to me with something absolutely direct? Jesus healed dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of people in his ministry. The number varies from gospel to gospel, but still, it's a high number. One or two of them had to be literate. They didn't write something down. They didn't. There's nothing at all. There's nothing. You go looking for it, and it's not there. Unlike almost any other historical character. Religious apologists will often say, well, are you going to say that Alexander the Great didn't exist? I mean, we have no original sources for Alexander the Great at all. In fact, all the sources we have for Alexander the Great date from far longer after he lived than the sources for Jesus. But you're not questioning that Alexander the Great existed. And I always want to say, A, don't try to smuggle in the identification of the Gospels as sources. They are not sources. They are not sources. They are mythology. And B, there are all sorts of evidences for a person's historical existence other than written records. And we have abundant such evidence for Alexander. There's no doubt whatsoever that Alexander existed, that he went on massive conquests across thousands of miles, that he employed thousands of people, that he was worshipped as a god in many, many places. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. The physical evidence alone, even without the documentation, is so clear that even if we didn't have the later documents, we would still know, beyond a shadow of a doubt. Whereas, try that same thing for Jesus. Remove the Gospels from history, if that's possible. It should be possible. St. Paul certainly wouldn't have been unhappy if you had him alone as the foundation of Christianity. That would have pleased him right down to the ground. Remove the Gospels from history. And then try to tell me anything about Jesus. When he lived. What he did. What he looked like. When he died. Nothing. Nothing. There's nothing at all. And that, for me, that means, not to get too Bayesian on you here, but if you can't do that, then I'm perfectly comfortable saying the person didn't exist. That there was no actual Jesus in Palestine at the time. Hitchens isn't willing to go that far. In fact, he makes a rather neat literary analysis of what he views as a kind of backhand echolocation proof that maybe there was such a person, because of all the convolutions that are done in the New Testament to get Jesus to be born in Bethlehem. The convolutions of Jesus' early life strikes Hitchens as an example of how that probably means there was someone. Otherwise, why would you fudge the record? Why wouldn't you just make it come out completely clean? I don't follow that completely, because the New Testament authors, the school of New Testament authors, that's what you think of these authors as, schools rather than people. The schools of these authors are very much concerned with syncretizing the New Testament with the Old Testament. They go out of their way to warp their accounts to make it possible to see those accounts as fulfillments of Old Testament prophecy. they go out of their way to do that, and I think that explains the whole Bethlehem business. But one way or another, it's a shame that there are other books on the subject. There are other books that are wonderful. Some of them are a little bit on the lunatic side, and it's a little shameful to see the way Christianity scholars, including many atheist Christian scholars, resort to their own pearl-clutching orthodoxy when a historicist comes around. They say, well, you're in the minority, or, this long tradition says that Jesus was a historical character, when you're supposed to be pointing to your objective proofs. You're not supposed to say, we're in the majority, so we're right. Anyway, it's a subject for another day, maybe, but that largely does the New Testament. The evil of the New Testament exceeds that of the Old. That is chapter 8 of God Is Not Great, where Christopher Hitchens you've seen many authors do it. He quotes from H.L. Mencken, who does a great job doing it. He's already quoted from Thomas Paine. There are plenty of authors who do this and do a really good job of it, where you go into the New Testament and you just find all sorts of problems with it and slap around left, right, and center. It's fun in a way to watch a writer of Hitchens' intelligence do it, but that is the heart and soul of this whole chapter. So we move on next time to chapter 9, and chapter 9 is the bomb in the hymnal. Chapter 9 is the explosive thing that Hitchens was expecting trouble from when he wrote, because it's about the Quran. It's about Islam. He turns the same rabble-rousing, iconoclastic view on the Quran, which is far more likely, when he was writing this book, it was far more likely to get you killed than doing that to Christianity or Judaism. So chapter 9 is the Quran is borrowed from both Jewish and Christian myths. And it is it's really well done. It is a really well-controlled chapter. So we'll talk all about that next time, and I will do my best to break it down for you. So I'm sorry about the length of this video. Good Lord, I can't turn on camera with you people without just nattering forever. But I will be back. I have more nattering to do. Thank you, Book 2.